You might not expect a stamp, a notebook, and a pair of sensible shoes to be the most dramatic items in a city of 11 million people, but in late Soviet Moscow, the budget for drama was small and already spent. We begin with the stamp. It sits inside a passport book, pale as an unbothered moon, and it is called a propiska. It is not glamorous, except to landlords and doormen who love paperwork the way cats love warm radiators. The propiska says where a person is allowed to sleep without anyone asking extra questions. It also says where a person is not allowed to sleep, which is almost everywhere else. If you're still awake in a few minutes, feel free to subscribe, or just blink slowly in approval. There is no penalty for forgetting either way. The day we're exploring is not cinematic. It keeps the same pace as a queue for bread on a Tuesday polite, resigned, with a touch of wool. It belongs to women who made a living at the edge of rules, who knew that edges have doors, and doors have doormen, and doormen have habits that could be memorized better than poetry. Morning begins with addresses. Not poetry either, but essential in the way a map is essential when every street looks like its neighbor in a snowstorm. A woman turns to her passport and confirms the stamp. Not because it has changed, it never changes in the morning, but because the habit itself is a kind of insurance. She checks a rent receipt, the phone number of a cousin whose voice can pass for an employer, and a small sheet listing stairwells where the light bulb is either burned out or enthusiastically dim. The militia likes light. The militia also likes schedules, especially those of train stations and interest hotels. And so the morning's first work is to know which officers stay in which lobbies. This sounds thrilling, but it is really cartography with gossip, a map made of routines. If an officer with a fondness for shiny boots has moved to the metropole, it is good to know because shiny boots mean shiny report forms. The apartment itself has a tone. It's a student if asked, a secretary if prodded. And no, there is nothing to see. If you're a neighbor who enjoys seeing things, clothes help. Heels are chosen for stairs, not stages. There is a coat that looks like it belongs to a person who keeps her hands full of paper more than anything else. The aim is not invisibility, which is difficult in stairwells that amplify footsteps like gossip, but normality that drifts past eyes as clouds drift past chimneys. Meetings are scheduled between public errands, post office, hairdresser, bread shop, so motion looks like motion and not like choreography. Names are borrowed from cousins. Stories are kept short enough to survive winter. To live by night, you must belong to the day, at least in outline. The real rehearsals are for papers and phones. A friend is a voucher. A doorman is a lock. A 5-ruble note folded twice is a key that takes its time turning. The women who do this job learn to count trains like others count calories. The noon train from Riga brings German visitors who enjoy museums, and therefore lobbies. The night train from Leningrad brings students who enjoy trains, and therefore stations. If you picture a spy film, you're too alert. Think instead of a conscientious clerk who loves stamps, but has decided to stamp life in a different line than the state intended, while still keeping the ink pad clean. The business itself likes quiet. So does the vocabulary. In a country that writes slogans in capital letters on factory roofs, these women prefer lowercase. The work happens later, but the day's real labor is the choreography of remaining absolutely uninteresting, the way a curtain remains calmly beige while history shouts behind it. It is perhaps the most Soviet skill of all, to be present and unrecorded, like a shadow with a library card. If a neighbor asks why you're always off somewhere, you answer with the precision of someone who has studied train timetables for their poetry. My aunt's flat needs a light bulb, you say. This is almost technically true, which is the favorite kind of true. When the afternoon begins to tip toward hotel lobby lighting, the game of finding becomes a game of not saying. There is a circuit known better than any bus route. The interest hotels where foreign guests live like birds in glass aviaries, observed by an ecosystem of doormen, receptionists, and small trees moved indoors to feel important. The lobby is a bulletin board with carpet. Nothing is written there, but everyone reads it. A woman steps through the revolving door, becomes part of the room, and does not make a scene. Even her perfume follows the rules. The first conversation is with the floor numbers and the elevator lamps. The second is with a doorman who has a memory as long as his scarf. To him, any woman without an interest badge is a potential report, but reports can be traded for gifts that keep the room quiet. Chocolates, a rare pack of foreign cigarettes, sometimes a scarf for his wife, whose birthday always seems to be next week. He will remember the scarf more fondly than the report. The elevator is not a flirt. It is a silent judge of shoes. An open door is an audition no one acknowledges. Eye contact is a language. A nod is a paragraph. A ride to the 5th floor with no one speaking is a complete short story of about 12 seconds length. Micro hooks keep the mind awake just enough. The lobby clock is always fast. The bell at the counter rings only when trouble has officially taken form. The ficus tree is from Sochi and doesn't like radiators. If the militia enters, the bell rings twice and everyone suddenly remembers errands. A woman steps back through the revolving door and becomes winter air. Her face is a postcard addressed to herself that says, "Later, away from the lobbies there is the local line," which has nothing to do with phones and everything to do with neighborhoods. Apartments host gatherings under the category people visiting other people, which is a time-honored Soviet hobby. A bathhouse, a stadium side street, a communal kitchen at 11 in the evening when the kettle gives small sighs. These are bulletin boards without carpet. Taxes are dispatchers and editors. They determine where the next scene can be safely written. You tell a driver the blue kiosk and he hears 2 stoplights, a left, and discretion. In these circles, the rate is reported in objects more often than money. The words are simple and designed for cold air. Coffee, jeans, plumber. Plumber means someone who can fix things that break when the pipes get discouraged. Everything is disguised as everything else, which is honestly how cities work even when nothing is illegal. Rooms rotate like planets. It keeps neighbors calm, landlords content, and notes and notebooks gently uninteresting. There is a rule to check for pictures of Lenin on the wall, not because he disapproves portraits do not have jurisdiction, but because a portrait means someone is proud of order, and proud people file complaints with neat handwriting. In case you're counting metaphors, yes, there's also a matching system of tea glasses, because Russians believe tea should be served in glass, so you can see exactly how much heat you are about to endure. To decline tea is to say that you do not belong to the room. To accept is to belong just enough to finish the glass and go. When the question of payment arrives, rubles are the least helpful item on the menu. The economy in the 80s is a seesaw where the money sits on one end and the goods sit on the other, and the plank is covered with snow. The safest currency is objects: jeans, perfume, coffee, nylon stockings, a small radio that pulls in stations like a fishing net. Goods move to farts of shiki, the black market traders who do accounting with shopping bags. They convert items into favors, then favors into coupons or foreign cash, or a note in the ledger of someone who will do you a kindness at a moment of your choosing. A day's earnings are a supply chain that passes through the hands of a shopkeeper. A taxi dispatcher may be an interest guide with a niece who loves blue denim as passionately as the state disapproves of it. Money itself is a polite rumor. It shows up late, nods to everyone, and leaves with a pocket full of promises. Everyone maintains a reserve. Not a savings account, those are for people who trust banks. And what a whimsical mood that would be, but a physical reserve hidden in a hem, a jar, a soap bar with a surprised cavity. Cash is folded into a matchbook that, ironically, never lights. The emergency fund has slightly different names depending on the city. For bread, for a train ticket, for a doctor who doesn't ask questions but does write letters. Health is a ledger, and clinics are the accountants. There is a line on certain doors KVD that announces inspection days. The certificate from such a day is both shield and rumor, because paper protects and rumors reduce the number of surprises. A neat stack of certificates in a handbag is almost a talisman. A small pouch carries soap, alcohol, and needles, and a spare lock for reasons one rarely explains. Partners are screened by time rather than by talk. Short visits mean fewer variables, like subway rides that take you exactly 2 stops and then feed you back to the street unremarked. When police arrive, and occasionally they do, the most powerful item in the room is a doctor's note delivered afterwards with the care of a registered letter. A note that says clean in a carefully stamped way works better than any speech. It travels between women like a borrowed umbrella, respected, folded, handed back. The morning after a scare looks almost like the morning before, except that the telephone is moved to a different table, as if the problem had been bad table placement. You might find this funny. It is gently funny in the way the entire era is gently funny for the number of objects that substitute for institutions. An enamel basin for a washing machine, a scarf for a contract, a smile for a receipt. Night enlarges the city and softens its edges. Now the rooms are chosen for exits, not views. The locks chain is measured before the glass is filled. Signals are simple because simple survives. 2 calls on the telephone mean safe, 1 means wait, which also means breathe slowly. Silence means leave by the stairs. Plates and taxi numbers are written on that noble matchbook that never lights. A handbook of loyalty printed on cardboard. Everyone knows who to wake if someone does not return. The list of names is shorter than you might think and longer than the state suspects. There's someone for doors, someone for phones, someone for tea, someone who counts the stairs because the elevator is acting like an aristocrat. The rhythm of the night is not wild. It's a metronome. There are small rituals. Shoes are placed near the door, ready to sprint if needed, but mostly they shuffle. Curtains are pinned at a particular height to keep the neighbors from seeing, but also to let the radiator think it is doing something heroic. A clock is turned to face the wall because time behaves better when unwatched. The quiet humor of the era returns and is always quiet to observe that the record of the evening is best kept as a memory and then forgotten on purpose. Records kept on paper can travel to strangers. A memory that is actively neglected is strangely safe. Outside, propaganda behaves like a very cheerful uncle. It says there is no such thing as what you are doing, and it continues to say this even while stepping over the queue that is obviously waiting for something. But a city learns to walk with that uncle without arguing. The morning after, reality returns dressed as errands. There are lines to stand in, for bread, for butter, for the rumor that a new shipment of lemons has arrived from the same place where summers are kept. There is laundry to pretend to enjoy. There are forms to fill in honest handwriting that does not betray how the evening was spent. The myth and the reality commute on the same trolley. They even give up seats to each other when legs are tired. Most days end where corridors empty, at a notebook that closes without ceremony. It is a quiet ledger. Who owes whom coffee? Which cousin played the role of employer? Whether the doorman with the long scarf prefers chocolate or a different brand of cigarette this season. Risks end where entries do. The notebook is modest. It sometimes lives inside a cookbook on a shelf because nobody steals cookbooks when flour is scarce. Above the shelf hangs a small calendar with a kitten. The kitten does not judge, and neither does the calendar. It only says which day the post office late window is open. The joke, if you can call it that, is that the most illegal thing in the evening is often the most ordinary thing in the morning. A train ride. A whispered referral, a taxi number written within the lines of a grocery list. The women who lived by these routines were logisticians first, comedians second, only occasionally romantic leads. They kept the city's secret economy ticking like the lobby clock, always a little fast, never exactly right, good enough to know what time to leave. If you're still awake, your pillow is probably softer than Soviet soap and lighter than Interest brochure. If you are not, the city continues without you, which is its specialty. Somewhere a door opens politely to exactly the width of a person. Somewhere a bell rings twice and no one looks up. Somewhere a scarf changes hands with the diplomatic gravity of a treaty. In the morning, the Propiska stamp will be checked again. The shoes will be inspected for any new squeaks, and the train schedules will be read like weather. The curtain will remain beige, which is the color of safety. Outside, slogans will say all is well. Inside, tea will say the same thing more convincingly. And so the day loosens, thread by thread, into the ordinary night that cities weave when no one is trying to make history. A matchbook closes without sparking. A notebook receives one last line, just an address and the word bread. The window is open a finger's width for good luck or fresh air, whichever arrives first. Even the doorman is asleep, his scarf folded like a well-behaved snake. Bureaucracy sleeps too, though the stamps dream of stamping. The streets cool, the tram lines hum like distant bees, and the door clicks once, very soft, as if a life could be carried entirely in a whisper and never spill. You might not expect a thin bar of metal to keep a whole country calm, but here we are. In a quiet Paris room, around the year when hats were taller than confidence. A platinum iridium meter rests on two small rollers like a thin cat on a windowsill. The room is cautious about temperature. A thermometer watches the wall as if the wall might do something impulsive. If the meter is happy, bakers will cut loaves to the right length. Tailors will argue less with gentlemen, and railway engineers will sleep as deeply as iron ever does. If you are still awake by the time I discuss the inspector's leather pouch for wax seals, feel free to subscribe or simply nod at a reasonable interval. The Bureau of Weights and Measures endorses both actions with equal solemnity. The day begins with keys. They do not look heroic. They look like the sort of keys that open a desk where a diligent ant keeps string. A clerk turns them one by one and writes the time in a ledger already crowded with very tidy numbers. Even the ink sits straight. The meter bar is not exposed to sunlight. Sunlight is enthusiastic and therefore not useful. The caretakers have a ritual borrowed from churches and watchmakers. They approach without hurry, fold the velvet cover, and breathe as if any excess air might add a micron. Yes, a micron is small. No, they do not trust it. They slide a wooden comparator into place. It has two jaws that are less jaws and more opinions. The bar is touched only with gloves, to see whether the world still agrees with itself. Brass rulers, iron rods, and the occasional argumentative yardstick are invited into the room and encouraged to relax on the table. Everyone waits for the temperature to settle down to 0.0 envy and 0.0 panic. When the needles stop twitching, the clerk says good, in a voice that would not wake a butterfly. Somewhere across the city, a baker is already chalking a line across dough, because a chalk line is easier to obey than philosophy. Inspectors exist to carry the calm from the room into the world and then bring it home again before supper. They pack like monks, a little padded case with check weights shaped like coins, a brass stamp for making the royal mark, which changes names depending on the regime and changes faces depending on who sits still long enough to be engraved. A tiny magnifying glass, a candle, spare wick, 2 sticks of sealing wax, one red, one a shire red. A thermometer because weather does not respect science. A notebook made of the sort of paper that adores grid lines. And a sandwich folded in wax paper that remembers last week's sandwich but makes no comment. The inspector's coat is not stylish but has excellent pockets. Pockets are the heroic age of reliable government. He walks to the first shop with a pace 1/4 of urgency. The street vendors are already testing their scales by placing an orange on each side, which is not recommended, but does make for a cheerful experiment. At the baker's, the wooden measure sits like a ruler that retired early. Loaf length has a name, which the inspector writes with pride because names are the handles of memory. The regulation wants 1 kilogram loaves to be a length between two pleasant numbers. Too long, and it is air being sold. Too short, and is disappointment with crust. He takes out his brass stamp, warms it over the candle, just enough to behave, not enough to swagger, and presses the mark on the shop's measure for another year. The baker watches as if the mark will butter the bread. The inspector does not ruin the magic by explaining it will not. He notes the time, the reading, and whether the cat on the counter appears sympathetic to metrication. The cat is non-committal. By mid-morning, the inspector is moving through a grid of small necessities. A grocer's set of weights sits in a nested family, the smallest one so tiny it behaves like a musical note. He checks them against his check weights, listening to the clink the way an experienced postal worker listens to envelopes for coins. The grocer confesses that the half-kilogram tends to wander. They all do, the inspector says, like ideas. He rescues it from the bottom of the drawer, where it was soaking with string and receipts. He writes down the result. The notebook begins to look like a very calm novel about peace. Micro hooks are scattered here like sesame seeds. The wine merchant's counter has a secret drawer for glasses. The butcher uses a piece of blue thread to hang the token weights, so they dry after washing. A passing boy tries to still gravity by lifting the inspector's case, and is astonished to discover gravity will not go quietly. People ask small questions. What if a loaf shortens when it cools? It will, says the inspector, in the same way that enthusiasm cools after lunch. That is why the law asks for length at the moment of sale, when bread is still hopeful. What if the iron rod expands in August? It will, he replies, and that is why we keep the platinum iridium saint in a room where August is not invited. Why platinum and iridium? Because they do not rust under criticism. Everyone nods. They were hoping for gold. He explains that gold has other engagements and does not enjoy maintaining a straight line when bored. At noon, another inspector arrives from a different quarter with his own case and his own sandwich, and the exact same handwriting. They exchange findings like two rivers passing notes. The conversation sounds like a lullaby made of numbers. It also includes gossip from another kind of clerical world, a town where the cooper uses an ellipse instead of a circle to save wood and calls it austerity, a bridge where the engineer wrote the height in chalk and the rain politely lowered the bridge. The meter bar remains at the heart of it all, like a quiet relative who writes no letters but funds the family. The inspectors part with the agreement that numbers sleep better when they've been talked about. The afternoon is for longer things. Cloth is measured in units with wonderful names. A bolt of wool tries to act infinite but ends at the mark, a fact it takes badly. The inspector measures twice, not because he doubts himself, but because he likes the calm repetition the way a child likes counting steps. If the shop uses L-sticks or older measures, he compares them with the ceremonial patience of a chess player who enjoys stalemate. He writes variability with intolerable whisper and marks the stick with a tiny punch. He shows the punch to the apprentice, who is delighted to learn that the symbol is a form of punctuation the state uses on wood. Somewhere, a poet will later make a metaphor of this, but not today. Now the afternoon drifts toward a problem with the personality of a gray sop. Volumes. The market sells oil by the liter in glass cylinders that are technically honest but practically slippery. The inspector carries a pewter later with a lid and a tiny air hole because the world would rather trap bubbles than admit to them. He pours slowly and copies the meniscus with his eye the way an artist copies a line. Everyone agrees that the line is both real and annoying. He teaches the apprentice the trick. Eye level, breathe out, decide with kindness. A small boy asks whether a meniscus is a monster. The inspector privately thinks it might be, but publicly says it is a friend who likes crouching. A side quest leads to a farmer's cart with a steelyard that hangs like a conversation that could be misunderstood. The farmer loves the steelyard because it lets him balance a sack with a sliding poise that pretends to be free of mood. The inspector enjoys it too, partly because the words sliding poise sound like something you could wear to a dance. He checks the distances engraved on the arm, and the weight of the poise scolds the notch that has become too comfortable, files it back to fairness with the smallest file known to bureaucracy, and stamps the tiny oval mark that says, "This has been seen." The farmer nods. The farmer's daughter sells him a bag of almonds that insist on weighing exactly what almonds weigh when watched. The city offers a collection of earnest objects that want to be correct. There is a public scale near the baths where men compare themselves to medical posters. The inspector wipes it with a cloth as if he were a priest. He explains to a man that wet hair weighs more than ambition. Farther along, there is a clock under a glass dome that tells the exact time once a week with extravagant accuracy, and then grows bored. The inspector sets his pocket watch by it, not because he doubts the watch, but because aligning small things makes the sole button its coat. At a bookbinder's shop, he measures a wooden press to confirm it is not stealing centimeters from customers' margins. The binder says he would never. The inspector replies that virtue loves a witness. They both smile at the glue. On the bridge, the wind collects hats and carries them to the river with managerial competence. The inspectors tuck their hats down and walk more firmly, as if the wind were a poor argument. They discuss the piece of lore every apprentice must memorize, the Paris Meridian, the stone kilometric posts that sprouted along the roads like quiet milestones measuring the empire's need to know where it is. They mention, with the soft pride of civil servants, that once upon a time a meter was defined by the earth itself, which is a flattering arrangement until you remember the earth does not hold still. Now the metal bar sits in its room like a retired athlete hired to represent stability. In this way, the nation moves between romance and furniture. The light turns a color secretaries appreciate, the one that tells you to put documents away and put potatoes on. The inspector visits a final shop where a set of apothecary weights smell faintly of mint and seriousness. He checks the milligrams with a feather touch. This is where he nearly smiles. Small accuracy is a hobby that keeps people from larger mistakes. The apothecary says he intends to live forever by measuring carefully. The inspector wishes him luck and marks the box. He writes the last notes of the day temperature, observations on draft, whether the counter wobbles, and includes a small drawing of the new cat because auditors respect sketches of cats more than you would think. The evening now leans against the windows and the city begins its other job of being pleasant. The inspector returns to the bureau by way of the bridge again because bridges count as thinking. In the vestibule, there is the solemn mirror all government buildings own as if by treaty. He straightens his tie for the ledger, not for the mirror. The meter bar is where he left it, of course. The bar never goes anywhere without an escort and a lot of signatures. Its velvet cover is folded back like a sentence waiting for its period. The clerk who stayed behind has dusted the cabinets in a pattern perfectly adapted to dust that will immediately return. Night in the bureau is the least dramatic night in Paris, which is its charm. In the basement are vaults where duplicates sleep in long boxes, each resting on supports shaped like small friends, so the metal does not deform from the loneliness of gravity. There are links of brass that travel as ambassadors to other cities. There are also meters not quite good enough for the first drawer but too dignified for the trash. They live as paperweights in provincial offices and are honored like retired colonels at parades. The inspector places his checkweights in their foam nests with the affection a librarian reserves for dictionaries. He warms the sealing wax and closes a packet with a stamp that kisses the edge of the paper, exactly where it should. Nothing is more romantic than precision that refuses to apologize. After the ledger is signed, and the ledger is always signed with ink that could send a ship to sea, he writes the summary report. The prose is deliberately sleepy, all in order. 2 corrections to steelyards. 1 note to cloth merchant regarding shelf tilt. Baker compliant, cat indifferent. He adds a remark that the apothecary's 3rd decimal is brave. He writes another sentence that future readers will appreciate for its absence of excitement. Somewhere a lamp hums the way bees write poetry. The shutters complain like old philosophers. It is a joyless symphony that somehow makes you want tea. What remains is the ritual of replacing the velvet cover. The clerk does it with 2 hands, equal in speed and in the absence of theater. The thermometer is checked, recorded, and reminded of its duties. The candle is snuffed with a cap that looks like a bell for very small saints. They lock the cabinet with the keys that do not pretend to be important, but quietly are. The keys return to their hook. A last walk through the hall reminds the floorboards of civilian virtues. The air inside is cooler than the air outside. This is the Bureau's idea of luxury. And then the best part for falling asleep, the inventory of the uninteresting. The spare gloves are counted because gloves multiply or vanish depending on how often they're noticed. The supply of grid-lined paper is tallied with friendly suspicion. No office has ever had the target number of pages. The blotter is turned. The sand shaker for drying ink is weighed for no reason other than habit. The feather pen is mended and aligned with a small ceremony of angles. A note is left for Madame L. Who knows which shop sells thermometers that do not enter politics? The inspector writes it as if writing a blessing. Please procure 2. Outside, Paris is practicing the saxophone and the smell of frying onions. The Bureau is practicing dormancy. Even the mice walk with restraint. The building settles like dough. The meter bar dreams of being a bridge just once, then decides no, it is happy as a definition. The inspector tucks his notebook into a drawer where hundreds of its cousins nap behind brown cords. He leaves by the side door, as he always does, because the front door is for people who think work begins with a flourish. The side door makes the street appear gently, like a polite idea. He walks home through a city that measures itself without realizing. Steps between lampposts. Paces from bakery to bakery to see which window fogs first. The river counts its arches. In the square, a man sells roasted chestnuts by the paper cone, and each cone is a lesson in approximate geometry, which is the geometry of hunger. A woman with a tape measure around her neck talks to cloth as if cloth could talk back. Somewhere a poet decides that a meter is exactly the length of a comfortable stride, and somewhere a mathematician sighs into his scarf. In the inspector's pocket, the check weights clink softly with the coziness of domestic silverware. He will sleep because his day was built to end. Before bed, he will lay his coat on a chair in a way that suggests the coat deserves a warm rest. He will place his keys in a dish and align them by length, not because he is obsessive, but because order sings a lullaby to his kind. He will check his pocket watch, which keeps time with the personality of a good cook, flexible but correct. He will drink a glass of water that might or might not be exactly 2 deciliters. No one will inspect. He will think of one shop, perhaps the apothecary, perhaps the baker, and hope their marks hold. He will imagine the meter bar, peacefully covered, held on its little rollers like a diplomatic document. He will turn down the lamp. If by chance you're still with me and not adrift, you can keep listening while the city settles. We could talk about the sealers who travel the provinces by rail, how they keep their stamps in tins padded with cotton and poems. We could talk about how farmers measure fields with a rope when wood is expensive, and how rope remembers rain. We could mention the postage scales that sit like small thrones in post offices, where envelopes are weighed with a seriousness that makes letters obedient. There's even the quiet comedy of lighthouse keepers who must measure oil by the liter and then pretend to be surprised when storms do not read instructions. All of it, all these small obediences to length and weight and time, is a kind of civic crochet. The pattern repeats. The city holds together because the loops are patient. The night grows quieter than ink. The bureau holds its breath at exactly the rate prescribed by experience. Somewhere, a baker is drawing a chalk line on tomorrow. Somewhere, a tailor folds a tape measure like a good manner. Somewhere, a boy dreams of stealing gravity again and returning it slightly improved. The bridge lets one last pair of footsteps cross and then keeps the count to itself. In a room that never invites sunlight, a bar of platinum iridium does nothing at all, which is the grand point. It lets the rest of us do things without arguing about how long they are. So you can rest now if you'd like, under whichever cover you prefer. The inspector has finished his rounds. The ledger has no more space for today, which is the warmest conclusion it can offer. Tomorrow will be the same, a candle sighing, a stamp warmed without swagger, a number written away a father ties a scarf. Nothing new, blissfully. The measure remains, the city nods, and the keys dream on their hook like small metal fish in a pond that never freezes. You might not expect the angle of a candle lick to influence an empire's bookkeeping, but here we are. In a small, careful office that smelt faintly of beeswax and chalk, a medieval candle excise inspector began his day the way many saints did not, by polishing a brass ruler and whispering to a ledger. The city around him woke with roosters and bargaining, but he woke with string. If you are still awake by the time we reach the discussion of wick-twist ratios and the proper length of a tapersmith as oath, you may subscribe or simply turn your pillow to the cooler side. Either action would count as compliance under the candle ordinance of reasonably early mornings. The inspector had a desk that tilted like a question and a stool that stayed on its best behavior only when sat upon. A box of small weights weighted like obedient walnuts. There was a wooden cone slit down one side, used for measuring the circumference of rolled candles. There was a wire with a loop at the end for lifting tapers without leaving fingerprints on truth. There was a traveling stamp with a lion that looked like a cat who had heard rumors of lions. This was the tax on light, not on sunlight, but on the cozy and therefore billable alternative. He checked the bell rope in the hallway, because time should be in working order before money tries to be. He tied on the city's sash a length of cloth, the exact color of authority at dawn, and read aloud the lines he read every day. The weight of a legal pound, the length of a legal foot, the price of a legal kindness if anyone needed to purchase one. From the window, he could see the long candle that burned in the market square as a public timer. It was scored with rings that melted down at known speeds. When the wax reached a mark, a clerk in a hat made a note, and a nearby dog adjusted its nap accordingly. This was the city's other hourglass. Our inspector admired it every morning, and never once used it to determine when to go to lunch, preferring the more accurate instrument called habit. The day's first stop was a monastery, because monasteries bought candles by the hundred and then pretended not to count them. The porter smiled the way people do when they are about to be slightly evasive but friendly about it. The cellarer produced a ledger with lines so straight they could persuade a river. The inspector set down his weights and asked for a sample bundle. Each bundle had 12 tapers, because 12 is a number that likes company. He weighed the bundle, weighed a single taper, then weighed his decision, which came down to, the wax was honest, but the wick was enthusiastic. Enthusiasm in a wick can cause a candle to drink faster than a monk on feast day, thus cheating the hour. He trimmed one wick with a small knife and muttered the standard advice, which in full Latin translates to something like, "Please twist less with your feelings." The monk nodded gently, as monks do when faced with bureaucracy that means well. In the corner, a brother cut tiny grooves into a pillar candle to make it appear sculpted. The inspector admired the artistry and affixed a small stamp of approval that looked, to the trained eye, like a clerical sigh. From prayer to profit, he moved to the market square, where chandlers sang softly to their vats. The vats were hot and smelled of honey that had met responsibility. Women rolled lengths of wick across their thighs, dipped, rolled again, dipped again, the motions rhythmic as spinning but more fragrant. The inspector watched the angle of a taper as shoulders, too sloped, and a customer would feel bereaved by dripping, too square, and the taper would smoke, writing its will on the rafters. He took out the wooden cone, slipped it around a fresh candle, and noted the result with the same small knob he used for decent stew. A boy offered him a bucket of water in case of accidents. He thanked the boy and set the bucket near the vat, which made everyone feel insured. A citizen brought a complaint that her last purchase had cried wax upon her tablecloth. The inspector examined the cloth, which was indeed teary, and the previous batch's wig, which had been twisted in the wrong direction, a sign not of heresy but of haste. He issued a polite warning and left a scrap of parchment bearing the municipal drawing of an ideal wig. 2 threads embracing like old friends, not like relatives auditioning for a will. He paused at the stall of a tallow chandler whose candles, being cheaper, made the city function in less expensive rooms. Tallow has a personality. It would very much like to be almost anything else. The inspector did not judge, but he did measure. He tested the snuff, a little iron cap for taming flames that preferred conversation with curtains. He inspected a batch of rushlights, the most humble illuminance of all. Dried reed pith dipped in fat and fastened in a little clip, good for short tasks and long rumors. He noted that the clips were tightened too lovingly. A rushlight that cannot fall as it burns will learn to fall suddenly, which half the city will call fate. He loosened them with a tool that looked like a tiny smile, and bought 2 for his own desk, which considered these humble asides a form of poetry. By mid-morning, the square brightened with gossip, and the inspector turned to the least glamorous duty of his route, the barrel check. Beeswax arrived in barrels, which, though chatty, sometimes lied. He tapped them in a sequence that meant, "Tell me your density," then skimmed a bit of wax for purity, kneading it between fingers the way grandmothers test dough. Good wax remembered flowers and pressed back slightly, like a well-bred cushion. Adulterated wax remembered nothing and gave up too soon. He heated a sample and dipped in a strip of parchment to see how it looked when it dried. A translucent, gentle shine meant bees had worked honestly. The merchant promised never to mix in less noble fats. The inspector said he believed him completely and wrote it down anyway, because belief without ink is a rumor. He stamped the barrel lids with the lion cat and moved on, leaving behind an aroma citizens would later call church, minus the incense, plus the expectation of reliable minutes. The next section of his day wandered to the households of small dignitaries, the mayor's assistant, a notary with 3 hats, a widow who kept accounts for 2 ships, and a dog. In these rooms, the inspector's job was to confirm that everyone was purchasing light according to rank without alarming the city into resentment. He measured the diameter of taper sockets, which told him what size had been burning there. He measured the pool left in candle pans to see whether thrifty devices were employed to save unburned wax from migration. He appraised the candle boxes for the presence of pilfered municipal stamps. He peeked at a set of elegantly painted snuffers and corrected the angle of their bell-shaped ends as if adjusting earrings. He gently reminded the notary that 3 hats did not require 3 lights at once on ordinary evenings. The notary agreed and blamed memory. The widow presented an ingenious clip that could hold the stump of a candle and extend its career by an hour. He congratulated her as an ally of both economy and bedtime. In the corner, the dog snored with such exact regularity that the inspector considered proposing it as an alternate timekeeper. He wrote in his notebook, 1 dog, 2 hats, thrift excellent, The city's laws on illumination sounded complicated when read aloud, but acted simple in practice. Markets must be lit while open, stairs and public inns must show kindness to feet, and any room where strings are tuned must have a flame large enough to discourage wrong notes. The inspector maintained stair candles with a zeal characteristic of men who once tripped. He replaced a guttering one on an inn's third landing and left behind a note for the keeper. "Remember the third landing the way you remember your mother." He checked the holders on the wall iron spikes bent into cups, making sure they did not encourage wax to weep onto travelers. Cloaks. In one hallway he found a candle set directly under a beam that had slowly acquired the memories of soot. He moved it with a small sermon on airflow. Nobody complained because breath is a humble teacher. By afternoon, his circuit led to the guild hall, where big candles were born for big ceremonies. These were pillars as fat as a child at a festival, poured in molds bound with rope, cooled slowly, written on with saints' names and dates. The inspector examined the molds for cracks and repeated a fact that every apprentice wanted to forget. If the mold leaks at the seam, the candle will lean like a thoughtful bishop and everyone will blame theology. He admired the thin sheets used for making decorated candles wax like yellow paper, cut into leaves and bands. He checked the dye powders stored in little jars, saffron for gold, a cautious mineral for red, the peculiar green invented by someone who liked the idea of spring and winter and didn't mind expense. He watched an experienced woman press a small seal into the side of a candle, the guild's mark, firm but not too deep, because deep marks make uneven burning, and uneven burning causes eau de sermon. He added the city's stamp next to it, at the polite distance specified in a regulation that had footnotes. The apprentices loved the footnotes. They turned them into riddles during lunch. On the way to the river, he was stopped by a complaint from the bell tower. The tower keeper swore that candles sent up for night ringing had a habit of being generous at first and stingy later, which is a personality many of us share. The inspector climbed the stairs that coil like a promise, laboring with due gravitas and careful knees. He inspected the lanterns that lived their glass on 3 sides, tin on the 4th to keep off the wind. He used his looped wire tool to lift a candle and weighed the stub in his hand. It had the exact weight of an accusation. He shaved the top and relit it, and the flame behaved like a coin that recognizes its portrait. He left 2 spare tapers and a note that basically said, "Stir less, trust more, trim regularly." The tower keeper nodded, produced a small flask for emergencies, and proposed that most problems in life could be solved by trimming. The inspector agreed, at least in matters of wicks and suspicious beards. By late afternoon, Riverlight turned the world into soup. The inspector crossed the bridge to visit the key chandlers, who supplied ships with light and therefore with stories. Here he checked floating lamps and small tin boats used on calm nights to draw fish up to curiosity. The boat lamps were reluctantly honest when level, recklessly romantic when not. He straightened a bracket, resoldered a hinge with the help of a man who swore every oath in 3 languages, and then apologized to the river for the 4th. He measured the reserve oil by dipping a marked stick, then wiped it carefully because oil has the social habit of shaking hands with everything. He stamped the cork stoppers, a chore nobody respected but everyone relied on. He watched the clouds stack themselves and thought about weather, which did not pay taxes but certainly collected them. Evening approached like a person who knows where the wine is kept. The inspector returned to his office with hands that smelled pleasantly of bees and metal. He recorded the day's measures in his ledger, the monastery's enthusiasm, the market's patience, the widow's clever clip, the stairs' 3rd landing. His handwriting could have persuaded a wolf to keep accounts. He blew specks of wax from the edge of the page and tapped in sand to dry the ink. He then consulted the big book of precedents, a sleepy brick that remembered every argument ever made about candle fees. There he found the case of a parish that had tried to count the hours of 2 candles as 1 day. The decision read in lawyerly Latin, "No," followed by a paragraph that might as well have said, "Nice try." He smiled in the way civil servants smile when paper prevails against mischief. He checked the lock on the traveling stamp, because tomorrow's lion cat must wake in the same shape it slept. As the first candles were lit in windows, he walked his evening round, a softer version of the day. He paused at doorways to evaluate domestic flame in the half-second that tells whether a house is careful. He admired a girl practicing letters by candlelight, her pen scratching like a small winter animal. He adjusted a shop's lantern that insisted on tilting to the gossip side. He reminded a tavern to set its candles away from the strings of dried herbs, not because flame hates time, but because time is a fan of drama. He traded a joke with a tinsmith about how tallow makes a clean conscience impossible and beeswax makes it easier. The smith replied that clean conscience is not a statutory requirement, but highly recommended on feast days. The inspector accepted this and bought a small tin cone for his nephew, who had a new fascination with extinguishing things responsibly. He liked to end the day at the public reading room, whose long table demanded even light. The attendant there, a woman who hoarded silence like treasure, nodded to him toward the wall where the candle shelf wore little brass crowns. He inspected the crowns for soot, adjusted their tilt by an angle you would not notice unless you own a protractor and feelings, and then stood with his hands behind his back like a successful shelf. A young man studied a chart that calculated how many minutes of reading you could expect from a candle, depending on the moon's assistance. The chart was optimistic. The inspector left a note correcting the figure for tapers with affectionate wicks. The attendant tucked the note into the drawer where wisdom slept between string and sealing wax. Now the city's night took up its right to be soft. Lamps were lit at the corners, sputtering politely until they settled into duty. You could hear the occasional hiss that means someone trimmed too brusquely. The inspector returned to his office, opened his personal candle box, one fat pillar for winter complaints, one half-burned taper for letters, 3 rushlights for thoughts that did not want to be overlit. He trimmed the pillar's wick to a bishop's haircut and set a glass chimney around it because drafts are rude and easily corrected. He then opened a tin where he kept fines collected during the day, counted the coins, and resisted the ancient temptation to weigh honesty on his scale. He preferred to let honesty rest unweighed but carefully placed. Before extinguishing his lamp, he made the inventory without which sleep is merely a rumor. 2 spare wicks, 12 seals, the little loop tool, 3 cones, 4 stamps, the case of weights, the folding knife, the peppermint for making the ledger friendlier, the rag for wiping wax that had opinions. He wrote tomorrow's route on a scrap and pinned it with 2 decisions. He mended the string on his ruler. He folded the sash, not with reverence, exactly, but with the respect owed to a companion that keeps other people from arguing. He whispered the regulations to the empty room, because the ear loves familiar laws at bedtime. Even outside, where practical people yawned, the tax on light performed its most graceful service. Nobody thought about it. A tailor finished an extra seam because his taper behaved. A midwife found her kneel without fuss. A porter negotiated stairs that remembered their 3rd candle. A student read 2 more pages and blamed the moon. A cat watched a flame flicker and decided against knocking over history. In the bell tower, a keeper trimmed and smiled. In the market, the big public candle sank to the brass line that meant near enough tonight, and a clerk wrote it down, and a dog accepted the news in full. If you have not already drifted into the pre-tax zone of sleep, we can linger on the smallest absurdities, the ones that make accuracy human. In a village upriver, they kept a goose candle, a molded bird that burned badly but made weddings cheerful. The inspector once had to declare that it could not be used to time municipal debates. In a quarter near the Potters, an old man specialized in scraping wax strips into little balls and selling them back as memory beads, which technically was legal because memory is often lumpy. There existed a superstition that a candle snuffed with wet fingers invited rain to the funeral. The inspector never touched that one, except to set candles away from windows that never learned courtesy. On a single winter, when bees were dispirited and prices rose, the city issued a temporary lenience to students, allowing two to a candle, but only if they alternated blinking. The rule was not enforceable, but it looked sincere on paper, which is half of government. Eventually, the inspector leaned back until his stool creaked the way honest wood does. He breathed out the day. He put the cap over the pillar's flame and listened to the faint, satisfied kiss of light closing its book. He left the rushlights untouched. There would be time for them when dawn asked the small questions. He locked the door with 2 turns as prescribed by a bylaw that admitted no shortcuts. He walked home along streets that measured their own brightness casually, the way bread counts slices by absence. Above, windows glowed with the arithmetic of domestic life. Below, wax hardened into puddles that would be peeled up in the morning and pressed into new thrift. In his room, he did one last, uselessly precise task. He measured the little pool a candle had left behind in a brass saucer and recorded it in a private notebook titled Estimates of Unfinished Light. The figures were of interest to no one but himself and possibly to the patient god of minutia. He placed the notebook under his pillow, not for security, but because the mind likes to sleep on orderly ideas. He stretched like a man whose job is to keep the city from making unnecessary darkness. He thought, with all the heat of a slowly cooling wick, that tomorrow would be much the same. He was right, which pleased him and would please you too, if you were listening for things that continue. We can end as the public candle ends, without fuss. The last ring melted, the mark reached. The clerk's quill lifting from the page in the precise manner of a bird who understands lists. Somewhere, a wax seal cooled. Somewhere, a wig remembered restraint. Somewhere, an accountant recalculated the rate at which comfort becomes ash. The inspector turned in his sleep, and the lion cat on his stamp faced the wall, as all good emblems do at night. The city, wrapped in those small lawful flames, let its thoughts smolder to warmth, not smoke, and folded itself into an uncomplicated shadow, which is the legal term for rest. You might not expect a day to be measured by the sound of elevators and the weight of a passport stamp, but in late Soviet cities, that was a fairly dependable clock. The work began with paper more often than with people. A small square of authority called a propiska told the walls where you officially belonged, and the walls listened. In the morning light, a passport cover soft at the corners. A registry office clerk tapped a metal ruler on a piniston. Wooden desk and a name, sometimes one borrowed from a cousin, took a quiet breath and tried it on for size. If you were still awake by the time we reached the part about how to fold a train ticket, so it looks like you already traveled, feel free to subscribe or don't. The lobby clock will keep ticking even if you drift ahead of schedule. The practical rhythm of the morning was not romantic. It was administrative, almost ballet-like. Who would vouch? Which stairwell was safest? Which doorman worked the day shift and liked sunflower seeds when he was bored? Monotone conversations rehearsed the same questions. Were you a student today? Or a secretary? Or visiting an aunt? The role was chosen for its pockets and its ability to carry a receipt. In the soft light, errands were disguises, and the disguises were heels chosen for stairs, not stages. The rule at noon was simple: blend well so you can bargain well later. The militia did not need to be dramatic to be present. They were a weather pattern that moved along train stations and in tourist lobbies, and people planned their umbrellas accordingly. A day's survival was paperwork practiced until it felt like handwriting you could do in your sleep. The city had bulletin boards that never announced what you actually needed to know. For that, there were hotel lobbies, taxi ranks, and the long, interchangeable hallways of foreign tourist shops where the glass was unusually clean. If you watched quietly, The revolving door of a big hotel performed introductions on your behalf. A diplomat's tie, a Danish travel group with matching backpacks, a man who spoke Russian like it had been translated for him twice. The interior's desk was a stage where nothing was said and everything had a direction. A lift ride could be a careful screening. Look once, not twice. Choose a floor, step out. If a bell rang twice in the corridor, it meant a doorman thought the militia found the stairwell interesting. Not a panic, just a change of elevator. Taxi ranks were calmer than they sounded. Drivers memorized numbers the way bards memorized epics. Dispatchers were editors of risk, trimming lines that wandered into the wrong chapter. In small apartments borrowed for a few hours, a buzzer code worked like polite poetry. Doors had signals that measured trust. 2 calls meant safe, 1 call meant wait, and silence meant please leave by the stairs because gossip sleeps light on this landing. The best conversations were short and used only nouns. Coffee, blue jeans, plumber words that didn't sweat under questioning. Bathhouses and stadium side streets filled gaps between tours for anyone working the local line. A quiet apartment gathering teacups, a radio playing just loud enough to keep the floorboards from listening, was often the evening's real bulletin board. Rooms rotated like schedules, so neighbors stayed calm, landlords stayed solvent, and the housecat developed a world-class poker face. Money was the least liquid part of the economy. Rubles were abundant in theory and scarce in practice, like sunshine in a photograph. Deficit over rubles meant payment in objects. A packet of coffee, a roll of nylon, a West German pen, jeans whose label traveled faster than the garment. You could move goods through middlemen called farts of shiki, who treated currency restrictions like they were persistent pigeons always flapping, never decisive. They turned items into coupons, favors, IOUs, or the promise of a small radio that worked when the power did. A day's earnings had a shelf life and a route, a little for the keeper of the key, a little for travel, and a careful portion for emergencies that preferred to arrive in pairs. Cash hid in soap, hems, and books. Nobody in the house liked to read. The volumes on Soviet civil procedure were frankly very secure. Partners were screened by time, not talk. The calendar was a clinic in its own way. Certificates spravki were both shield and rumor. A good spravka could comfort a nervous policeman and a nervous aunt, sometimes simultaneously. Condoms existed. So did shortages, soap, alcohol swabs, a spare log, a doctor's kindly neighbor. These were the health plan. If police arrived, the longest sentence in the room belonged to a medical note, because doctors' handwriting extends time like taffy. It was a world where prevention meant learning the weather patterns of people, not pathogens, where the neighborhood polyclinic had a back corridor full of quiet nods, where vodka functioned as currency courage and disinfectant in that order, and sometimes all at once. Night work was a change in verbs, not in heart rate. The city dimmed and the notebook opened. Plates and taxi numbers lived on a scrap of paper you never let see daylight. A safe stairwell was familiar to your feet more than to your eyes. The door chain was measured before the glass, and the glass knew it was not the main event. Scenes were practical. A radio playing outside the room to indicate ordinary life continued, a kettle on as alibi, a chair wedged lightly because wood respects gentle arguments. Windows were considered accomplices, curtains learned not to twitch. 2 calls were kind, 1 was suspense. None was the signal to dissolve backward into errands. The night also belonged to myths, which are the city's way of explaining itself without paperwork. Propaganda said something does not exist, and the queue looked up, shrugged, and kept walking. The queue always knows. The quiet economy of favors blat-moved goods from shelf to person with the elegance of a well-timed yawn. Morning errands disguised the night's transactions as shopping lists, trading lines, calm faces, tired feet, a pair of imported pantyhose that would become rent. When the notebook closed, the risk narrowed like a corridor that had finally figured out where it was going. There was no dramatic ending, just the door shutting quietly on a life carried without display, paper kept, voice low, courage filed under Tuesday. The soft choreography of staying unseen began with clothing that read as student or secretary, because spectacle was for parades. Heels were chosen because stairs have opinions. A handbag learned to carry a rent receipt, a comb, and a story short enough to remember cold, visiting my cousin, bringing aspirin, looking for a friend's address. Sometimes a name traveled across the day by borrowing a relative's patronymic. Kinship networks are larger than dictionaries. Meetings happened between queues. The bread shop was neutral ground. The post office was safe if you liked stamps. The hairdresser was best of all because everybody leaves changed and nobody asks how much. Foreign cash was suspicious and scarce. Safer promises were penciled on scrap paper for later, often later than anyone preferred. The police rhythm was predictable if you set your metronome to boredom. Militia patrolled train stations because trains deliver stories with luggage. They lingered in tourist hotels because stairwells make instant stages for little dramas of authority. In the day, you prepared explanations for these small audiences. In the evening, you rehearsed them with the mirror so they would be ready at curtain. The interest circuit was its own geography. A revolving door inhaled and exhaled hard currency with the steady lungs of a brass samovar. The lobby plant knew languages. Bellhops learned to read posture the way meteorologists read clouds. If an elevator ride lasted more than 3 floors, you were not paying attention. Doorbells had codes that lived in wrists like music. A bell ringing twice was a muttered prayer. A doorman preferred gifts to trouble, not because he was corrupt, but because gifts are easier to file. Treaties were drafted at the counter with nothing written down. A matchbook with a number stood in for contract law. Taxi drivers maintained a small statistics bureau in their heads, where the militia stood, which hotel checklists were ambitious, how long it took to get a foreigner from the lobby to the souvenir shop and back without incident. A dispatcher could edit a night by rearranging 3 cars and 2 names. The city loved editors. Meanwhile, apartments on the local line filled the calendar between tours. Stadium-side streets were good for quick handshakes. Bathhouses were louder, but steam is a surprisingly loyal confidant. And flats, teacups left damp coasters that indicated how long a conversation could last. Rooms rotated to keep landlords calm and neighbors uncurious. The refrigerator hummed and did not testify. Payment moved like water, finding new courses after a dam. Goods were time you could hold. Coffee could be traded for tape recorder repair. Jeans could be traded for silence. A small radio could be traded for anything because news is a primary need with antennas. Farts of shiki were logisticians in leather jackets, conducting an informal MBA in stairwells. They transformed objects into acts of scheduling. A day's earnings were distributed across envelopes that pretended to be unrelated. The shared phone lines keeper, the woman who knew which passport window moved faster, the doorman who liked seeds, a clinic nurse who liked Polish chocolates. Emergency funds lived in soap, wrapped in wax paper. If you needed the money, you had to wash your hands for a long time, which in its way was wholesome. Clinics were precaution more than cure. A spravka soothed everyone's nerves by existing. Partners were chosen with the caution of librarians shelving rare books. No sticky fingers, no loud commentary, no sudden loans. Short visits meant fewer surprises. Doors prefer patterns to plot. If police arrived, a doctor's note spoke first and longest and often ended the conversation because bureaucracy recognizes its own handwriting and grows sleepy. Night work had a rhythm the city understood even when it pretended not to. Signals were a language with a small vocabulary and very good grammar. Plates and taxi numbers were written on a matchbook that never lit. The chair near the door learned to lean at a strategic angle. Shoes were placed toe out for quick exits because efficiency is a moral virtue after midnight. Windows were disciplined to ignore low voices. The chain stayed measured. When myths knocked, reality opened with a secondary lock. Everyone knows propaganda's favorite phrase is "does not exist." The Q, which does exist, quietly arranged a barter economy in which imported shampoo could be exchanged for classroom grades, and 2 tins of meat could be exchanged for forgiveness. By morning, errands disguised the works so thoroughly that even the day felt it had imagined everything. Lines were stood in. Calm faces were ironed. Tired feet minded their business. The notebook entered its final act of quiet. It closed. That was the whole ending. No finale, no confession, just a corridor that remembered how to be a corridor again. We might pause to notice the curious stability of doormen, who acted as border guards for buildings rather than nations. A good doorman could hum along with the hotel radio and still notice who exited the elevator on the 2nd floor when they had definitely pressed 5. He could whistle the tune of "Keep Walking." He could tell a foreigner by the way they held their shoulders and a policeman by the way they didn't. Gifts worked better than bribes because gifts are happier to be remembered. A carton of cigarettes carried more peace than a wallet and less paperwork than a debate. The lift itself was an instrument for disagreeing with schedules. If the militia liked the 3rd floor at 7, the 2nd floor at 6 became suddenly fashionable. The city pivoted like a dancer during an encore lightly, a little theatrically, and entirely for balance. There were small absurdities that helped the day along. Jeans were a currency and a map. Their brand names told you which corridor you were in. Nylon had seasons like fruit. A West German pen wrote faster than a Soviet one, in a way that seemed ideological, though it was probably ball bearings. You could time the scarcity of soap by how clean the rumor mill sounded. A clinic hallway had the world's quietest echo. There were always people who insisted that a handwritten note from the right person could outvote a regulation. They were sometimes correct. An import shop sold finished butter, which tasted like winter vacations and also like permission. A standard apartment tablecloth could cover a lot of improvised economics if you set the teapot in the middle. The moral universe of the day was not heroic, but tidy. Keep records. Carry small change in goods. Know 3 names for the same thing and choose according to audience. Be polite to stairwells. They do more work than you think. When you need to disappear, become an errand, post office, bread, hairdresser. When you need to be found, become a complaint. The hot water is not hot. The kettle leaks. The neighbor sings loudly and always in the wrong key. Carry a pencil because ink draws attention. Carry a comb because it's plausible. Carry an address because someone will ask. The night's quiet record was meant to be unremarkable in the morning, and this wish was often granted. The ledger of the day, the one kept in the head, subtracted drama on sight. When fatigue arrived, it caught up softly. A bench, a shared phone booth, a seat in the 2nd car of the metro, these were intermissions. People slept standing up with the steadiness learned from breadlines. The city let them as long as they didn't try to be comfortable. Comfort was a scheduled event. The last appointment was with sleep and a notebook that closed like a very small door. There was a pillow that remembered everything and never testified. There was a lamp that did not pretend it had seen nothing. It simply dimmed. Propaganda, which had worked all day at its own desk, also went to bed. The queue, which never slept, stretched itself like a cat and watched over the street. If the question was what they did all day, the answer was not lurid. It was logistical. They woke with paper, wore a roll that fit like a borrowed coat, read stairwells like schedules, listened to bells that meant a doorman was thinking, traded goods that spent like minutes, filed health in Spravky, and let the night's quiet record account for itself before morning folded it into errands. The strange part is how ordinary it all sounded once you learned the vocabulary. The dry humor of survival. 2 rings mean calm. Blue jeans mean currency. A doctor's note means the conversation can end without anyone claiming victory. And in the morning, the revolving door exhaled again. The lobby clock clicked once, and a passport booklet opened under a shaded lamp to a page that understood it was also a map. In that soft, administrative light, the day rehearsed being a day, and everyone, quietly competent, hit their marks without applause. You might not expect the world's idea of 1 kilogram to spend so much time asleep in a velvet-lined box, but it did for more than a century, under a French lawn that looks very confident about hedges. Morning at Severs began with keys, not debates. A caretaker's pocket held a ring like a small planetarium, 1 key for the building, 1 for a gate, and then the more interesting ones, the ones that woke up nested safes. No sirens, no drama, just a respectful clink, then the gentle thud of a door that knew its job. If you're still awake when I get to the part about wiping metal with alcohol to discourage fingerprints you cannot see, feel free to subscribe or forget to. The kilogram has waded through worse. The air in the vault was steady in temperature and personality. A logbook lived on the table, its handwriting becoming calmer as the years went on. A set of white cotton gloves waited beside a chamois cloth. The object of attention, an iridium platinum cylinder, whose only job was to be so exactly itself that other things could be compared to it, kept its secrets in a bell jar. A second bell jar sat over the first, because redundancy sleeps best. Someone breathed, someone did not, and the lid lifted with a movement so slow it felt like etiquette. The cylinder shone the way old rules shine, quietly, like good manners. The ritual never hurried because the weights did not. There were witnesses, official cousins of the cylinder, made of the same alloy, given numbers, given small engraved crowns that looked like punctuation. They spent their days in nearby safes, all believing with polite confidence that they were the same, all hoping the comparisons would agree. Before any weighing, a cloth would sweep the stand, then the bell jar rim, then the table, a choreography of circles that must have looked calm even on frantic days. There was alcohol to remove imagined oil. There were brushes to remove imagined dust. There were silent prayers to remove buoyancy, which is not a sin but insists on being corrected. The balance itself was a poised piece of furniture. It had its own cabinet, its own glass, its own voice if you knew how to hear brass. When the pan settled, numbers followed. They did not shout. They were read in pairs, subtracted, logged, repeated, and then cross-checked against last year's, handwriting to make sure sanity had not drifted while Europe argued about coal. Couriers came into this world like calm comets. A case would arrive wrapped as if it contained a dessert, only heavier, and stamped with the authority of men who wore hats on purpose. Inside, another case, and inside that, a stack of screw lids and velvet saddles. And then finally the visiting kilogram, a cousin from a national laboratory. It had traveled quiet roads, watched by a bored customs officer who could sign his name without looking, escorted by a small letter that said in 3 languages, "Please handle with courtesy, this is mass." In the hallway, accents met like conductors trading batons, one from Copenhagen, one from Torino, one from a country that had changed its name since the last comparison. Nobody needed to say why they were there. The cases said it more politely. In the balance room, comparisons began. A visitor sat on one pan. A resident sat on the other. The pointer trembled dramatically, then remembered itself and came home to 0. If it did not, notes were made, faces stayed blank, and coffee cooled at its desk. The goal was to be bored together, the purest, scientific wish. The funny thing about a kilogram is that air has opinions about it. Air presses, floats, nudges. and likes to stick tiny layers of water and hydrocarbons onto metal the way a tired commuter collects flyers. So before numbers could be called true, the lab pretended there was no air. Experiments lived under glass with pumps that sighed like contented cats. When vacuum was achieved, a bell rang somewhere in a technician's pulse. The cylinder, which never spoke, lost a few micrograms of its invisible coat. That coat had a name, sorption, which sounds like a soft drink but is really patience. Tables corrected buoyancy as if apologizing for physics. There were gauge blocks to check pan height. There were thermometers to take the room's temperature, which never got a fever. At some point, someone said, hysteresis aloud, and the balance pretended not to mind. Not all of the work lived in Severs. Out in the wide, methodical world, national metrology labs treated their kilogram standards like family silver with a passport. A technician in a British lab would put on gloves, the same white kind, and lift a cylinder with 2 hands because respect weighs exactly as much as it needs to. In a basement in Helsinki, a student would write a string of zeros on a calibration certificate and feel simultaneously powerful and irrelevant. Germany had weights with names that sounded like railway timetables. The United States had K20, a cylinder that enjoyed travel and paperwork. Argentina's kept better hours than some ministries. Every so often, a courier would pack one in its velvet cradle and fly it to France. Airline staff would ask whether it could go in the hold. Someone would answer, not unless you have a climate-controlled conscience. And the case would be belted into a seat, a charming violation of ticketing habits. Snoozing under a blanket of exemptions taught the money of this world was not cash. It was agreement. Trade requires scales, and scales require something to tell them when they're correct. Flour mills, pharmacies, postal counters, chemical plants, rocket fuel tanks, everyone paid tribute to the quiet cylinder by believing it was right. A kilo of apples in Tbilisi, a kilo of nails in Katowice, a kilo of bread dough in Marseille, they all leaned on a decision made under glass. You can tell a civilization by what it decides to keep dry and constant. The kilogram asked only for a stable room and occasional dusting. It did not insist on processions. It did not enjoy scandal. When newspapers wrote about it, they used adjectives like solemn and surprisingly small. Children who visited on school trips pressed their noses to glass and were told in low voices that this was the thing all other heavy things copied, which is the closest an 8-year-old gets to metaphysics before lunch. There were micro-hooks if you knew where to look. One year, a technician noticed a scratch so thin it looked like a rumor. Another year, the dish of a balance showed a smudge that nobody could identify, and the entire building turned into a detective novel without suspects. The cleaning protocol was tested like a patient clicking a metronome. Hot water, alcohol, steam, dry air, weight, weigh, record. Someone somewhere always argued about the order of the steps. Iridium and platinum together made a metal that laughed at corrosion. Pencils did not. Pencils were retired for fountain pens because graphite sheds, and no one wanted to answer for a wayward microgram of a clerk's day. The vault door seal was replaced one winter when it began to sound like a complaint. A bell jar was polished in circles that didn't end so much as fade. Evening came early in a building that loved constants. Comparisons closed like eyelids. Witness kilograms were returned to their safes with the ceremony of teacups going back to their saucers. The main cylinder, the Parisian sovereign of sameness, settled under its glass as if it had no agenda for tomorrow, which it didn't. Logs collected signatures in a handwriting famous for being legible. A guard made the same joke he had made in 1979, and it landed with the same gentle thud. Don't let it go on a diet. Out on the lawn, the hedges retained their opinions. Lights switched off with a confident click of people who had found nothing interesting today and were deeply satisfied by that. In another building, people discuss the ampere and the Kelvin and the mole because units travel in packs. A graduate student tried to explain to a friend at dinner that the kilogram might one day be replaced by a constant and was asked, very reasonably, whether that would make the apples lighter. It would not, but the conversation paid for dessert that night brought theories that slept badly. Was the cylinder losing weight? Was it gaining? Compared to its witnesses, it appeared to drift, a tiny polite drift like dust deciding which windowsill it prefers. Papers were written, conferences were held. Someone showed a slide with a slope that looked like a sigh. People proposed culprits, cleaning, fingerprints, sorption layers, or the universe's sense of humor. Public imagination supplies drama when given a vacuum, which is why a few newspapers announced that the kilogram was dying, which it was not. It was doing what all things do in air, negotiating. Meanwhile, industry kept weighing bolts and butter, and nothing fell out of the sky. The bell jars continued to be lifted by gloved hands, and balances continued to frown until they forgave themselves. The redefinition came as all sleepers come to consciousness, slowly, then all at once. People began to talk about the Planck constant in voices that suggested lullabies. A device called the Watt balance, later renamed the Kibble balance, promised to tie mass to electrical measurements with a ribbon made of mathematics. Another method counted silicon atoms in a sphere so perfect that it made mirrors feel unkempt. The work was fussy in the way that mountaintops are fussy about oxygen. Labs calibrated volts with Josephson junctions, ohms with quantum Hall effects, and then assembled the parts like a quiet orchestra warming up. The kilogram, if rewritten as a number tattooed into physical law, would no longer need a small metal representative under glass. It could be anywhere there was a careful balance, a careful current, and a careful mind. People worried about the sentiment of it, as one does when a beloved piece of furniture is replaced by the idea of furniture. On the morning the vote was taken in 2018, there were no streamers. There were suits in a glazed room and a gavel that liked its table. Representatives of nations raised small signs that meant yes. The kilogram exhaled into the Planck constant like a diver surfacing into air he already knew. Journalists looked for metaphors and borrowed fish. Back in Zephyrs, the cylinder stayed in its vault. It was still the same height, the same diameter, the same color of certainty, and it suddenly had less work to do. Now it was an artifact, which is a promotion of a kind. The Kibble balances around the world took up the daily task of realizing the kilogram from constants, a phrase that sounds mystical and turns out to be mostly spreadsheets and patience. If you listened in those labs, you would hear motors hum, coils rise and fall, a laser gossip with a mirror, and a technician note the room temperature as if taking the pulse of a very shy animal, and yet nothing changed in the shop. A kilogram of flour continued to be a kilogram of flour. The scale of the market, which had never heard of Planck, still tipped for pairs. Freight still weighed itself obediently before crossing borders. In kitchens, the brass weights used for family cakes kept their ancestral dent. If anything, the world became slightly more itself, because now a kilogram lived wherever a certain value of a certain constant conspired with a certain instrument behaving. It is a very dull conspiracy, the kind you want all conspiracies to be. Asterisk, asterisk. The old cylinder, if it had feelings, might have been relieved. It had endured generations of caretakers and their tender anxieties. It had accumulated stories like dust that had been carefully removed. It had motivated the polishing of jar rims in so many countries that glass became the most international language after music and sighing. It had met cousins who arrived in velvet and left with certificates and folders that snapped shut like small verdicts. Its audience had been composed mostly of patient people who enjoyed precise silence. Its workday had been a century long and free of commute. If it could speak now, it would likely say nothing, because that is the style. The last thing to notice is trivial and therefore comforting. The gloves remain. Even in the age of constants, people still put on white cotton before touching weights. It is half tradition and half hedge against oily skin, and that ratio will never be measured exactly because it doesn't need to be. The logbooks remain too, their pages patient as bed sheets. The vault door closes with the same geometry of trust. The hedges continue to supervise the lawn. Somewhere, a courier still straps a case into a seat because rules have a sense of humor if you ask the right way. And in labs you will never visit, someone leans over a balance and waits for a pointer to stop talking. And when it does, they write a number that looks like it slept well. If you're awake, you can imagine the sound the chamois makes when it meets the metal soft. Small, slightly squeaky, like the world acknowledging itself. If you're not, the kilogram will keep counting for you, very slowly, forever, and you can wake later to the agreeable news that weight did not wander in the night.d with a certain instrument behaving. It is a very dull conspiracy, the kind you want all conspiracies to be. Asterisk, asterisk. You might not expect a brick to count as a receipt, but for a long, smooth stretch of British history, a brick covering a window was exactly that, an itemized acknowledgement in terracotta that someone had met the treasury halfway. The window tax did not ring bells or march soldiers. It arrived with a pen and a measuring stick, which is the quietest kind of conquest. Inspectors wore shoes that knew how to be ignored. They did the rounds with a ledger under one arm and a patience that seemed professionally trained. If you're still awake by the time we reach the part about counting windows that were technically not windows because someone leaned a wardrobe against them for a strategic 6 months, you can subscribe or simply let the problem dissolve like chalk dust. The ledgers won't mind either way. Mourning for the tax began with doors that were taller than memory and keys that felt heavier than the law. A knock would come that could be confused with the wind. Names were confirmed. Addresses were squared. The local rate list whispered its way down the street, one frontage at a time. The rules were strangely human in their geometry. Fewer windows meant less tax, but what counted as a window developed a personality. A pane with boards across it was still, tragically for the owner and joyfully for the clerk, a window. A hole that had been filled with brick to the full thickness of the wall, however, was not a window, no matter how much the plaster remembered of you. There were thresholds for numbers. Up to a certain count, you paid one rate. Beyond it, another. And beyond that, a little editorial sigh was added to the margin and the figure rose again. Townhouses learned to squint. Country houses rehearsed selective blindness. Builders quietly suggested that stairwells preferred darkness and that servants enjoyed developing excellent night vision. If a stone mullion sat where glass used to be, the law had to consider whether glass had ever genuinely existed or if the builder had merely expressed a hypothetical. The legislation spoke in tidy columns, but lived in paragraph-shaped. Arguments thought there was paperwork before there were people. The tax station's room smelled like ink that had finally made friends with paper. Was set in stacks, always taller than the cup of tea beside them, as if to reassure the tea that it would never be necessary to work for a living. An assessor's desk held a ruler with a nickname, a blotter with a past, and a pair of spectacles that did most of the thinking. Numbers traveled down each page like a parade determined to be quiet. The clerks knew which streets were proud and would not be argued with, which streets were shabby and would bring biscuits out as currency, and which streets were so new they still had builders' ladders leaning casually against their claims. The language of the entries had a lulling rhythm, number of windows, rate applicable, total assessed, remark. The remarks were where the drama should have been. but mostly they read like a librarian's gentle notes to future librarians. 3 covered. 2 very small. Owner says morning light not desired. By mid-morning, a blunt pencil went to work in the open air. Counting windows is as simple as it sounds and somehow still needed training. The law disliked windows hidden behind ivy, which means gardening took on unexpected fiscal dimension. The inspector stood at the end of the street and performed a small, private arithmetic on a house's face. Ground floor, 1, 2, 3. First floor, 1, 2, 3, unless that one is half the height, which might make it a lightsome opening rather than a true window. Mark with a dot to research. Attic, irregularities submitted by architecture. Around the back waited the truth. Yard doors presented opinions. Sash frames performed their best impersonation of innocence. The polite houses kept their shutters open on inspection days out of respect, then closed them the moment the boots were 2 corners away, as if nothing had happened and it had all been an unusually detailed dream, because the tax was on windows. Those who paid it developed the calm ingenuity of people negotiating with grammar. New terraces were built with blank panels where openings should have been, features that architectural guides later described as blind windows with a straight face. Carpenters learned to complete rooms without calling attention to the idea that daylight might want to visit. Plasterers became experts in smoothing out the ghost of a former frame until only memory could see it. Someone invented the skylight and pretended it had always been there. Landlords discovered the thrill of claiming a window was part of a staircase, which is not a proper room, which made it sacred, which made it non-taxable, which made it irresistible. Disputes were negotiated with the memory of a footstep. Do you, sir, have reason to linger on this stair? Answers varied by season. There was a polite superstition about the law, as if taxation could be lulled into kindness. People would unhook the curtains and fold them away, imagining that less softness made a better argument for thrift. Drawing rooms put their best tables in front of hypothetical light to demonstrate that nobody wanted it. Some households placed a large piece of furniture in the exact space where sunshine disliked being told no. Other households, these were the modernists, embraced a style that could be described as the deliberate gloom of virtue. They spoke about the moral development of eyes trained to appreciate shadow. Doctors disliked this very much and wrote pamphlets with titles that sounded like lullabies but were actually scoldings. On ventilation has a very calm idea, notes on the efficacy of daylight in lending cheer to lungs. The debate proceeded at walking speed. Nobody marched. They annotated instead, asterisk, asterisk. The social map of the tax could be traced by the densities of bricks. In poorer streets, windows disappeared the way biscuits disappear in a committee break steadily with a sense of purpose. In richer streets, the tax was simply paid, and then paid somewhat ostentatiously, as if to remind the middle that transparency was a luxury. While the law pretended to be blind to wealth, it noticed patterns. Inns, hospitals, factories, and almshouses made petitions about classification, each with paragraphs that sounded like a request for a small, practical miracle. We require windows to observe patients for their own good. We require windows to keep vats honest. We require windows because the poor are, in this one respect, identical to everyone else. The replies were often sympathetic and very neat. Exceptions were granted the way teaspoons are given at tea, one for you and one for you. And this one we will save for later. Inspectors had their own micro-legends. The house were a narrow window hid behind a chimney and admitted light only to spiders. The factory with false shutters indicating windows that were never there. The country estate whose owner had persuaded an Italian architect that daylight was provincial. They learned to listen for the sound a boarded pane makes when you tap it with the back of a fingernail. They learned that curtains hung on an empty wall still move slightly when the door closes, which is not a haunting. It is simply air in the mood to gossip. They learned how to read the exterior paint like handwriting, finding the outline of an X window under the new gloss, as if the wall were blushing. One inspector carried a length of string and would hold it across the facade to check alignment. If the string jumped where a pane should be, the ledger received a small triumphant dot. Payment day had the mood of market day without the produce. The ledgers came out like old friends. Names were called with a cadence that suggested a parish register. Coins sounded like agreement, which they were. Some brought banknotes wrapped in the kind of politeness that expects to be refused and is instead counted. A few brought petitions, which were gathered carefully and placed beneath the weight that kept papers from going on adventures. People did arithmetic in public with the caution of people crossing a stream on polished stones. If I break up the last two in the east-facing room that no longer exists because it is now a cupboard, does that put me in the lower schedule? It does. Then please admire the speed with which I suddenly dislike morning light. The officer would smile in an official way and note the intention in pencil, with the understanding that the bricks would be inspected for sincerity at a later date. Health threaded through the whole business, the way a draft threads a corridor. Writers considered whether the tax made cities gloomier than they needed to be. Parish clerks, who kept counts of things most people prefer not to count, suspected that fewer windows made more coughs. Caricaturists and newspapers drew houses with blindfolds, people feeling their way to teacups in daytime through rooms that expected tripping. Meanwhile, in kitchens and workshops, the ordinary work went on with a resigned choreography. Lamps trimmed at noon, chimneys persuaded to behave, teenagers learning to read with their heads tilted toward the brightest wedge. A fashionable argument suggested that privacy was the true luxury and that windows were roomers with hinges. It did not catch on, but the conversation was polite enough to pass for an idea that had. There were, as always, clever contraptions. Glaziers offered panes with frosted patterns that made a window look smaller than it felt. Joiners created internal borrow light panels, narrow slices in a wall that let daylight travel from the rich side of a room to the thrifty side. Someone invented the fan light that sits over a door like a thoughtful eyebrow, letting brightness pool in the hallway without being caught by the counting gaze from the street. Masons became experts in bricking in as a reversible art, building closures that could be reopened when the law went away. The trick was to bind the new work just enough that it survived winter, but not so much that chisels would sulk in a friendlier year. A few houses kept careful stacks of dismantled frames in their attics, neatly labeled. Like optimism in kit form, every inspector kept a private list of the best and worst disguises. The best one, someone would say, was the terrace that painted a false keystone where a window had once been, creating the illusion of masonry where there had, tragically for revenue, been daylight. The worst was a curtain hung in midor to suggest an opening, which fooled nobody but the curtain. The most audacious was a brewer who installed a row of extremely small panes legal, windows if one leaned one's face very near and squinted, which kept the fermentation vessels company and technically kept the taxman honest. The most charming were the townhouses that carved mock shutters into the plaster, a permanent wink at passing bureaucracy. There is a record of a building in Bath that put mirrors where glass should have been, so the world saw itself rather than the drawing room, which is a comment on taxation or vanity or both. Asterisk, asterisk. Afternoons, quiet by instruction, were for revisits. A page would list properties to be reviewed after alteration. That word covered a multitude of ingenious renovations, from whole walls that had decided to be more like themselves to new closets that existed only in correspondence. The inspector's knock resumed its career as a minor weather event. Dogs barked, as was everybody's right. Chimneys practiced speech and smoke. People showed off their newest bricks with the satisfied air of somebody who had framed a certificate. Skilled bricklayers learned to make the infill match the old work so well that, from a distance, there was no narrative. Close up, the line between the bricks looked like a seam in a jacket tidy. Expressive, quietly proud of its tailor-dot evening, brought arithmetic in its most sedative form. Totals were struck. Columns were ruled the way gardens are ruled straight, with room for creeping things at the margins. Surpluses and deficits introduced themselves to each other like shy cousins at a reunion. The ledger's leather relaxed. Someone blew sand across an incline to help it dry. The sand had a round, good-natured personality and went back in its box without complaint. A postal boy came and went with the lightness of people who do not yet sign anything. And then, after a small supper, there were still those lonely remainders of the day, the addresses that had been avoided, the houses where nobody had answered because everyone had been promising to pretend. There was no door that day. Night in window tax country had a particular flavor, a mixture of soot suppers and polite quiet. Lamps moved behind curtains like constellations. The brickwork newly applied in daylight seemed to settle into the facades as if they had always slept that way. On streets with money, nothing changed except the number in the ledger. On streets with less, light pulled mostly downstairs, where work and meals happened, and left the upper floors to the governance of moon and habit. Neighborhood cats discovered their own reflections and pains and made the same conversation with them every night. The inspectors, at home and off duty, grew tender about their own windows in a way that people often are about the thing they measure. Some left theirs open too long just for the scandal of it. Most shut them at the usual hour and examined the latch fondly. There were myths in circulation that were both wrong and useful. One said that placing a large potted plant in the opening turned a window into a garden, which was not taxable because gardens were God's idea and you do not tax those. Another insisted that if you painted the panes with milk, it turned daylight into something decorative rather than functional, which the law respected and left alone. A more complicated one advised families to gather in one room so they would need fewer windows glowing at night, which saved candles as well as coin, and created a sort of communal geography of warmth that people later remembered with a surprising fondness. In the mornings, after such economies, the glass would be misted with the breath of shared dreams, and someone would draw a finger through the fog and make a rectangle, which was, by coincidence, the exact shape of a window. The end of the tax came slowly, like a person waking up after a very long nap and wondering why the room has been arranged this way. Campaigners wrote letters that developed a confident tone. Doctors produced statistics with the same care they used to fold their stethoscopes back into cases. Merchants suggested that more windows meant better shop displays, which meant more business, which meant the Treasury would be interested to note more of other kinds of taxes. Members of Parliament produced speeches that were calibrated for both Hansard and the after-dinner telling. When repeal finally happened, it didn't feel like a revolution. It felt like a maintenance visit. What followed was not a stampede of glass, but a dignified queue. Bricked-in openings were unbuttoned carefully. Joiners returned to attics and unwrapped frames from their long nap like family silver. Glaziers stood in the light and squinted, thinking about angles, then installed panes with that satisfying click of putty pushed home. Streets slowly widened, not physically, but in mood. Rooms discovered what time of day they were. Stairs admitted that accidents were not a hobby. Curtains became a conversation again rather than a disguise. The inspectors made their last rounds and found themselves counting for pleasure, a perverse habit they later grew out of and then retired to other metrics. Some of them moved to weigh bridges. A few took posts in customs where everything is a window if you think about it. The record, as always, survived better than the buildings. Bound volumes with raised bands and the smell like polite museums still sit on shelves and let their numbers nap. If you open one and run your finger down a page, you can feel the sedated pace of civic life in rows of careful numerals. You can see the little remarks that meant nothing then and everything now. Too bricked since last, the archaeology of light reduced to a margin note. Old streets still show the traces to anyone walking with the hobby of noticing. Blind windows wink in brick. Painted keystones lift imaginary arches. Houses display a faint palimpsest of fiscal modesty. Tour guides point and say things like, "You can see where the opening was," and everyone looks and nods and pretends they knew all along. And in the evenings, when everything looks like a story, even if it is just wall, you can stand in front of a building that once unlearned how to see and watch the light put itself to bed behind real glass. It becomes obvious that the tax was never truly about money, or at least not only about money. It was about the way law enters a room and sits down without asking whether there's a chair. It was about the friendliness of daylight and the stubbornness of brick. It was about counting, which is one of civilization's more soothing hobbies. If you're still awake, you can count the panes from the pavement and imagine the whisper of a ledger closing for the night. If you're not, the windows will count each other 1, 2, 3 until morning, and the street will be exactly as bright as it needs to be when you open your eyes. Asterisk, asterisk. You might not expect a day to begin with a stamp as small as a postage mark deciding where a person is allowed to sleep. But the Soviet propiska liked to start the morning by reminding everyone that paper can be a wall you carry in your pocket. The hotel desk is not loud. The revolving door sighs. The clock clicks once like a waiter clearing his throat, and somebody opens a passport booklet under a shaded lamp with the gravity of opening a small theater. Names are checked against addresses. The address is checked against a permit. The permit is checked against a smile that will be forgotten in 3 seconds. The militia patrols stations and enters lobbies by habit the way pigeons patrol squares. They are part of the scenery until they are suddenly the whole scene. Survival here is the choreography of paperwork. A woman can know which doormen are friendly because they are bored, which stairwells have lights that break at exactly the same 2 steps, and which night clerks can be persuaded that an identification number is a kind of lullaby. Clothes are chosen to pass on stairs, not to be noticed on stages. Shoes know how to be quiet on Soviet tile. The rule is simple. Blend at noon so you can bargain at night. If you make it several minutes into this without your eyelids filing a complaint, feel free to subscribe, or simply give a drowsy nod in the direction of the subscribe button and let it handle itself. Nobody is taking attendance. The phone list for the day is short because short is believable. A cousin has a cousin who knows a number that rings twice. If the desk has changed shifts, and once if the doorman with the memory returns. Meetings are placed between queues, so motion looks normal. A bread shop line where everyone experiments with patience. A post office where envelopes smell like dust and duty. A hairdresser where scissors click like very small machinery. Stories are kept short too, not because long stories aren't enjoyable, but because the temperature around the ears in a northern city makes memory act like an honest stenographer. Names are borrowed from other names. The Soviet Union excelled at names that sounded patriotic and therefore ordinary. The morning contains errands that look like ordinary errands, a receipt here, a train schedule there, a rent slip folded into the passport like a pressed leaf. That rent slip matters. Without it, a night has nowhere legal to end. A woman who knows the rulebook better than the rulebook knows itself can navigate gaps between phrases. Temporary registration, guest of a comrade, visiting a sister, which may all be true in the way a Tuesday is true even when it feels like a Thursday. By late morning, the city has arranged itself into habit, and habit is the closest thing to safety that bureaucracy ever provides. Finding clients is a task that prefers signals over sentences. The interest circuit is a quiet bulletin board disguised as a hotel lobby. Behind glass, brochures guess enthusiastically about how happy a foreigner could be, while the actual foreigner watches his reflection try to look purposeful. Taxi ranks, bar counters, and the square in front of the museum are pieces on a board everyone pretends not to see. A lift ride is its own small interview, a glance that says no, a nod that says maybe, eyes that look at the floor because the floor has never betrayed anyone. Doors open. Someone steps out at an earlier floor to keep the timing uninteresting. Doormen prefer gifts to trouble and trouble to paperwork. A bell can ring twice if the militia has stepped inside. Once if a conversation might continue tomorrow. Or not at all if tonight is best described as not so much cancelled as rescheduled by fate. Foreign cash is rare. A safer promise is a receipt for later goods, which, in this economy, might be a pair of jeans that have never known a Soviet washing machine, or a tiny radio that speaks in voices from far away and does not ask for a party card. It is possible to spend an hour without speaking at all and still leave with an appointment. If you have ever navigated a family gathering using only eyebrow communication and tea placement, you already understand the system. The local line is its own network. Separate from the lobby's normal choreography, bathhouses, stadium side streets, and apartment gatherings fill a calendar that pretends to be empty. A dispatcher knows numbers and also edits risk like a cautious. Typesetter 2 calls are safe. A third call means wait, and sometimes silence means please find a stairwell and let the evening pass you by. But words are simple on purpose. Coffee can be a meeting. Blue jeans can be a price. Plumber can be a person who fixes a problem without owning any tools. In a city of neighbors, rooms rotate to keep ceilings from memorizing the same voices too often. Landlords prefer calm tenants to interesting stories. A quiet visit is a good visit. The rule of thumb is that no sentence should need a second comma. Commas draw attention, and attention is a currency the state prefers to keep for itself. The city's walls develop a talent for discretion, and the elevators, those upright communal diaries, record nothing. Money is an improvisation in a system where rubles buy obedience, but not necessarily objects. Deficit over rubles is the way the decade is organized. Payment lives in things, a pair of jeans that signal the mysterious West to a Moscow street, perfume that turns a corridor into France for 15 seconds, coffee that tastes like the promise of staying awake for a future that may or may not happen, nylon stockings that are both garment and passport, a small radio that makes the kitchen sound like elsewhere. Goods move to farts of shiki, the gray market traders who can change objects into other objects, into dollars, or into favors. A day's earnings pile themselves into categories that would make a planner smile. Keeper, travel, emergency, tea. Cash hides in a book nobody borrows, and a hem that nobody points at, inside a bar of soap that will go to a clinic someday. Dollars are discreet because they are shy. Rubles are loud because they are patriotic. Somewhere between them is safety, measured in pairs of shoes that do not squeak. Health is a different ledger, everything written in pencil. KVD letters mean inspection days. Clean certificates are both shield and rumor. A clinic card has corners that wear soft from being checked at doorways where a nurse knows the difference between worry and negligence by the way a person breathes. Soap, alcohol, and needles travel in a pouch with a spare lock. Partners are screened by time. Regulars are proved by the absence of surprises. Strangers are met with short visits that gather data before gathering anything else. If police arrive, tradition writes that a doctor's note speaks first and longest. The clinical room is quiet in the way train compartments are quiet lots of listening. Everyone's staring at shoes, paper moving from one flat surface to another like ironed laundry. The doctor's pen is calm. A stamp lands on the page with the authority of a rubber mallet. In a different economy, privacy is purchased with a different currency. Here it is acquired by knowing when to be as unremarkable as wallpaper dot by evening. The city switches to its night rhythm, a timetable with more signals than stations. The chain on a door is measured before the glass because the glass can make promises it cannot keep. 2 short rings on the telephone mean safe. 1 longer ring means wait. Silence, which in other countries is considered impolite, is here understood as the most generous advice. Plates and taxi numbers are written on a matchbook that never lights. A notebook closes, and the risk inside it closes with it, like a hand over a candle flame. Everyone knows who to wake if someone does not come back by morning. This knowledge is a form of community the newspaper never writes about. Rooms measure sound with care. A radio murmurs through a towel. The stairwell learns to count footsteps that never pass through paperwork. The night is not a drama. It is more like accounting, with square corners and narrow columns where you put either a yes or a not tonight. The morning after is a mixture of myths and errands. And myths are just errands disguised as legends. There is the legend that propaganda says it does not exist. The queue knows otherwise and keeps walking. Windows still open to let steam out and let rumor in. Most days start with errands that look like any other citizen's to-do list. Trading lines, calm faces, tired feet, a detour to a kiosk that sells dignity in small bottles. A visit to a clinic with a look that says, "I am here for a routine matter," and a paper that says, "It was routine." A quick stop at the savings bank because money that sits in a pocket begins to imagine itself important. Work ends when corridors empty. Risk ends when the notebook closes. The door shuts quietly, and the day takes on the shape of paperwork again. Passport kept, voice low, life carried without display. A woman knows which tram lets her watch a river rather than a uniform. Which park bench belongs to old chess players? Who would notice if something unusual happened and would describe it later like chess? Without adjectives, the afternoon is meant for small economies. Jeans are converted into support. A small radio becomes a ticket that is never punched. The dispatcher edits the calendar with pencil smudges that promise to wash off. Sometimes there is enough to send a parcel to the cousin who loans a name. Sometimes there is not, and the budget becomes a poem about tea. The city is good at hiding need inside hospitality. A glass of black tea poured from a pot that never stops is a kind of public service announcement that nobody reads aloud. If a woman is lucky, she can gather enough to reclassify an apartment room from improvised museum of necessary objects to reliable base. If not, the world remains a changing room without mirrors. Most problems, small or medium, are solved with favors. Large problems are solved with lateness until the problem gets bored and goes home. People who survive long learn the difference. Late afternoon is for the interest circuit again, where the lobby chairs have memorized everyone's posture. Foreigners change money into paper things, then paper things into glances, and glances into plans that sound like weather forecasts. Later, perhaps after the match, the bartender polishes a glass in the formal way that means he is really listening. An elevator learns who will get out at which floor before the button lights up. Doormen negotiate the border between hospitality and survival with the skill of diplomats, whose only treaty is that the hotel must not appear foolish in the morning report. Sometimes a suitcase is heavy with nothing but the idea of elsewhere. Sometimes a coat pocket is heavy with a decision made earlier by a desk clerk, who decided that the rules were written for people who have time to read them. Evening thickens into the city's standard issue desk. Signals and doors take over again. The chain that was measured now is used. The lamp that looks like a prop in a studio actually provides excellent mood lighting for quiet conversations about train schedules and fabrics. Someone remembers to turn the radio down when the news begins to use the tone that means history is about to happen and would prefer witnesses. 2 calls mean safe, 1 call means wait. The phrase call again tomorrow is the local translation of not this evening, but we trust tomorrow to be safer and less interesting. Taxi numbers get written on a different matchbook because the first one has become overly autobiographical. A pocket notebook receives 3 letters that look like decoration and are enough to reconstruct a quiet history if anyone ever needs to do that, which nobody plans to, asterisk, asterisk, if there's danger, and there is always danger. But usually the polite kind, its footsteps echo like someone practicing a language they do not intend to speak fluently. Propaganda says the trade does not exist, which gives it the oddly protective camouflage of official invisibility. The queue knows otherwise and keeps moving forward because bread is bread even when theories are talking. Work ends when corridors empty. Risk ends when the notebook closes. The door shuts like it has practiced all its life, and every practice door is a technology. A life is carried without display, not from shame, but from the logistics of staying available for next week's groceries and next month's rent. There are stories, of course, and some are even true. But most of the time, what happened is that people went to work and then went home, and the paperwork either cooperated or got bored. Asterisk, asterisk. There are small, mildly absurd facts that make historians sit up and then fall asleep again. A Moscow bathhouse could be a networking event if you had the right towel and the correct ability to admire steam without comment. Stadium side streets were popular not because of romance, but because the crowd functioned as a noise machine, like a modern white noise app, except without a subscription. Jeans acquired an exchange rate more stable than the ruble for at least a fortnight at a time. A radio the size of a deck of cards could open doors that loudly insisted they were not doors. Clinic dictionaries had more euphemisms than a poet, and fewer adjectives than a weather report. Dispatchers could do arithmetic that turned 3 phone calls into a living. An elevator ride taught people the skill of standing at the correct distance from another person's hope. These are thin facts, light enough to float in the air and obscure nothing, which is exactly why they make for excellent bedtime history. Night returns with its crisp routine and its soft light. The city lets the heating click and cough. The windows become suggestions rather than announcements. The stairwell gives back the footsteps it borrowed in the afternoon. A notebook lies shut, and inside it the day dries like ink. If you are still awake and somehow fascinated by ledgers, permits, vouchers, tickets, and the way a bell can ring twice to say, "The uniform just came in," you may subscribe, although there is no penalty for drifting away before doing so. The story, such as it is, keeps walking at the same pace, which is the pace of people who know that being early is noticeable and being late is an opinion. Morning will bring the stamp again, that small square of rubber certainty pressed onto paper like a minor blessing. The suitcase under the bed will continue to be half-packed because optimism likes to sleep nearby. The phone will ring either twice or once or not at all. And the city will keep its own record in the quiet way cities prefer. A record made of stairwells that remember, doors that obey, and lives that choose the safest direction at the slowest possible speed until the tea cools and it is time for bed. Asterisk, asterisk. You might not expect a single rubber stamp to decide whether a person is allowed to sleep in a city they already live in. But the Propisco was fond of small, decisive gestures. It left violet rectangles on paper like polite bruises and told a clerk whether a body belonged to a building. The day begins under a shaded lamp where the passport booklet opens with the quiet authority of a hymn book. A revolving door exhales. A lobby clock clicks once, exactly as if it remembered an appointment and then forgave itself for being late. The desk worker straightens a stack of registration slips that have frayed into soft, obedient corners. She asks for an address, and then who will vouch for that address, and then which stairwell the vouching might prefer. Militia uniforms stroll their usual laps around stations and interest lobbies as if walking the dog of public order. The choreography of survival looks like paperwork, a receipt slid behind a passport page, a rent stub peeking out, a phone number tucked into the second fold. If you're still awake in a few minutes, feel free to subscribe or merely make a mental note shaped like a yawn. Either way, we will proceed at the speed of a Q.morning is for practicing invisibility by means of specificity. Heels are chosen for stairs, not for stages. Skirts know the exact length that says secretary in winter and student in spring. A coat's buttons refuse to shine more than the floor does. Names are borrowed like winter hats returned if asked, but otherwise content to travel. The first errands look like everyone else's errands. There's a line for bread that proves the city woke up on schedule. There's a post office where the air smells like twine. There's a hairdresser where scissors recital tiny metronomes. Between these stops are brief visits to stairwells with friendly acoustics, to doorways that can be left open by accident, to corners of lobbies that are technically not there. The rule is simple. At noon, be so convincingly ordinary that night owes you interest. Paper performs its small miracles. A rent receipt explains that a bed exists. A train ticket, even an unused one, explains that the owner belongs to motion. A telephone token buys 20 kopecks of privacy, which is the most privacy available in a building with shared walls and a landlady who can diagnose life events by ear. The day's list is both practical and theatrical. Retrieve a parcel, return an empty bottle for a full one, slip a clean certificate into a folder that lives behind a radio manual. None of this is urgent. Urgency is suspicious. The city likes you best when your footsteps keep time with its heating pipes. Finding clients without saying so works because most buildings have learned to talk with their eyes. The interest circuit is a bulletin board disguised as a lobby. Behind glass, posters offer alpine meadows to people who own 2 sweaters. In front of glass, foreigners look for coffee that tastes like an apology. A taxi rank hums as if the pavement were mildly electrical. The elevator has discovered that interviews can take place between floors 40 seconds apart. A lift ride is a screening, eyes meet, then don't. A nod happens in the peripheral vision. The floor indicator blinks out the world's smallest code. No one speaks until the door is almost open, and even then sentences prefer to remain nouns. Doormen, those saints of plausible deniability, prefer gifts to trouble and silence to reports. A bell with 2 rings means a uniform has stepped inside. A bell with 1 ring means tomorrow exists. A bell with no rings means try the stairwell. Foreign currency is a rare and skittish animal. Safer than money is a promise to trade later for something that makes sense. Blue jeans that contain more hope than fabric. A small radio that refuses to be patriotic on command. Perfume that persuades a corridor to imagine France. The local line uses its own vocabulary. The bathhouse steam is weather. The stadium's side streets are a news service, and apartments double as calendars. A dispatcher knows telephone numbers the way a chess player knows openings, and edits risk with pencil marks that disappear if a lamp is moved. Taxes publish a schedule known only to the people who never read it. The code is aggressively simple. Coffee means coffee until it means 4 o'clock. Blue jeans are either payment or an alibi, depending on who folds them. Plumber is a human who fixes a problem without ever touching a pipe. Rooms rotate not because conversation is interesting, but because neighbors like the same silence to return every night. To be polite is to be brief, and to be safe is to speak a sentence that fits on a ration coupon. In a country fond of slogans, Brevity is the only banner that never raises suspicion. Money here is less a quantity than a choreography of objects. Rubles buy things officially. Objects buy everything else. A day's earnings line up on the table like characters in a play. Jeans, perfume, coffee, nylon, a battery for a traveling radio, an envelope of American gum that smells like contraband in childhood. Goods migrate to farts of Siki who know how to turn a bottle of cologne into half a winter coat and half a winter coat into 2 tram rides. Dollars live inside soap until needed. Rubles live in a jar labeled pickles whose future is less certain than the label suggests. Some rooms contain an emergency book that nobody borrows. If it is ever borrowed, the borrower returns it with 2 bills pressed inside like leaves. The household budget looks like poetry. There are lines called bread, rent, heat. There are lines called dentist and sudden shoes. There's always a final line called tea, which is not an expense but a moral category, health and its documentation. Move along a parallel track with more stamps and fewer confidences. KVD letters mean inspection days. Clean certificates are shields that also function as rumors. A clinic's hallway is modern art, a series of chairs that do not face each other, a coat rack that understands discretion, a window that never fully closes. Soap, alcohol, and needles travel in a zippered pouch with a spare lock because locks themselves are reassurance. Partners are screened by time. The longer nothing happens, the safer everything feels. The doctor's note is a passport for the intimate geography of the city. If the police arrive, the doctor's sentence speaks first and longest and usually weighs more than it should because it has standing with the stamp. The clinic's waiting room has a harmonica of coughs. Someone reads a newspaper that is brave about international wheat harvests. Someone else studies their shoes with the zeal of a scholar. Health, like currency, prefers to move in denominations of routine. Asterisk, asterisk. By night, the city adopts its theater lighting. Curtains learn to be great thick-lidded eyelashes. Hallway bulbs brighten one landing and give up on the next. The chain on a door is measured before the glass because the chain knows more about honesty than the glass ever will. Telephones speak in code. 2 bursts are safe. 1 means the field is muddy, and a long pause means please be somewhere else. Plates and taxi numbers are written on a matchbook that never meets a flame. A notebook record sums compact enough to survive a sudden knock. Everybody knows who to wake if someone does not come home. The friend with the loud voice, the neighbor with unassailable knitting, the cousin who can explain anything to anyone by referencing a factory. Rooms are careful with sound. Radios breathe through towels. Conversation treats walls as dignitaries that ought not to be offended. The window becomes a line drawing of the street, a tram like a thought, a man carrying a bag that can only be potatoes, a policeman who has perfected the art of strolling with a destination that never arrives. Propaganda insists the trade does not exist, which gives it the useful camouflage of folklore. The queue knows otherwise. It keeps walking, buying bread, comparing apples, discussing electricians who never come. Most days are errands disguised as errands. Work ends when corridors empty. Risk ends when the notebook closes. The door shuts with the confidence of a tool used properly. Life is carried at waist height, not hidden so much as carefully balanced, the way a person carries a pot of hot soup to the next building. There are stories, some improbable, some inaccurate, and some beginning with the solemn phrase, a friend of a friend. The truth is usually smaller, like a receipt, names, dates, a sum, the stamp that turns private arithmetic into public silence. A few mildly absurd facts drift up whenever anyone studies this era long enough. A pair of jeans could acquire a temporary exchange rate identical to a decent winter coat. A tiny radio gave a kitchen a foreign policy. Elevator etiquette became a form of poetry that rhymed nod with floor number. The bathhouse worked as a professional network not because anyone scheduled it, but because steam makes a convincing argument for anonymity. Clinic euphemisms multiplied until a single phrase could do the work of 3 diagnoses. Dispatchers memorized more nicknames than a classroom teacher. Even taxi doors learned to open as if they understood that a conversation might slip out and get lost. The bureaucracy, which prided itself on great thicknesses of paper, was sometimes defeated by a paperclip. None of this is thrilling. It is simply textured, which is more restful than exciting. The second half of the night moves with housekeeping precision. Sheets are straightened because downstairs a cleaner will notice if they are not, and noticing is a form of testimony. A cup of tea sits on a saucer whose crack looks like a map of a tiny empire no one can name. The clock declares a time that may or may not be true because power likes to blink at odd hours. Outside, snow takes the city's edges and rounds them off. Inside, clothing dries over chairs, a domestic forest of sleeves and careful plans. Somewhere a radio murmurs a weather forecast that sounds like low-stakes poetry-like precipitation in places, a variable wind that refuses to choose. If a knock comes, it will be timed to the hour that suggests either friendship or bureaucracy. The difference is how long the knock waits between its own beats, morning after. Myths are sorted into 2 piles, the ones that fit into envelopes and the ones that evaporate when exposed to daylight. There is a myth that foreign currency is heavy and makes pockets hang unevenly. The real danger is the receipt that proves how it was earned. There is a myth that the police always know. Usually they only guess better than the neighbors. There is a myth that the permit office resents love. The office is indifferent to emotions and obsessed with margins. Work resumes where the corridor echoes say it ought to. A person delivers a parcel that weighs the social amount. Another person purchases the exact 2 items that belong together: bread and matches, tea and batteries, apples and thread. The rhythm is small, precise, and sustainable. If an afternoon permits a nap, the nap is taken with the dedication of a civic duty dot. By late day, the interest loop wakes again. Lobbies practice polite forgetfulness. Bellhops study suitcases for the educational purpose of guessing what kind of maps they contain. A foreigner tries to exchange optimism for information and ends with either coffee or both. Doormen guide the border between hospitality and policy, like linguists explaining a preposition no one loves. The elevator learns who will step out first long before the buttons light up. Sometimes plans are made in the language of weather likely, perhaps, better tomorrow, because meteorology is the best available model for human agreements. A suitcase may be heavy with nothing but shirts. A pocket may be heavy with a decision. The city is good at teaching which is which dot when evening arrives again. It looks kindly similar to the last. Chains are measured, lamps are dimmed to the brightness of trust. Windows surrender their day jobs and become mirrors. The phone rings twice or once or not at all. Taxi numbers migrate to a new matchbook because the first has become too much like a diary. Notebooks receive initials that would amuse no one but their author. Palms memorize the weight of a key. The street below is a procession of small, Ernest Aaron's dogs who understand socialism in their bones. Men who could carry potatoes in their sleep. A grandparent with a string bag that always contains exactly 1 more onion than expected. Nothing extraordinary happens in the sense that newspapers mean. Everything important happens in the sense that kitchens mean. Asterisk, asterisk. Asterisk, if you are somehow still awake, which is heroic, you might appreciate one last history adjacent to sleep. The Soviet city was a machine that demanded drama from official parades and calm from private citizens. The people learned to generate calm the way apartments generate heat, slowly, constantly, with radiators that clank like polite ghosts. Work that everyone said did not exist found ways to fit into that calm, keeping careful accounts, carrying small tools, memorizing stairwells, trusting doors only after testing them with the chain. It was not glamorous. It was not even especially secret if you measured secrecy by how often a queue looked at its shoes. It was simply ordinary life lived under complicated verbs: to register, to verify, to wait, to return. The night has folded over the city again, and the stamp that started this day is asleep somewhere in a drawer. The desk clerk has stopped straightening the papers. The lamp under the shade keeps its halo to itself. The elevator stands still and therefore tells the truth. And the clock clicks once more, not to insist on time, but to suggest that another quiet day is already putting on its shoes. Asterisk, asterisk.